Welcome to the Power of Nature podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Waldo. In this show, I talk about how nature and the natural world can communicate with us, how it can communicate directly and individually with each of us, and how this can create immeasurable benefits for us in our lives. I share stories of my experiences doing this as part of a regular and ongoing practice, and I talk to others about their experiences with the power of nature as well. So join me as we go on a journey of learning about the power of nature, how it can communicate directly with us, and the impact that it can have on our own lives. Welcome back to the Power of Nature podcast. In today's episode, I am talking more about or continuing this discussion that I started in episode 12 about the power of birds. In episode 12, I talked about a few experiences I've had with the power of birds and how birds have communicated with me and helped me, and in fact how an experience with a tiny little bird in Rome, Italy changed the entire trajectory of my life. If you haven't listened to that episode, feel free to check it out. You might find it interesting before this one. But today I feel called to kind of talk a little bit more about birds and how birds have been a wonderful avenue through which nature has communicated to me. And to me, what that really means is my inner self has communicated to me through nature, through the power of birds. And I've talked about this in the show, that I find that when nature is communicating to us, it is really our own inner selves that is connecting with nature. And then nature kind of becomes the conduit of that communication. And it is a communication of information, guidance, clarity, feelings, gifts, health, well-being, etc., that at some point we are calling ourselves to know at some deep level. And by going into nature and experiencing nature, it's like it becomes a vehicle for that communication. And in today's episode, I'm really talking more about birds, because birds have played that role for me in many different ways. I don't know that I'm going to get through all of my bird experiences today, because they've been there have been many, but I'm going to talk about a few and we'll see where we get to, because I think birds are very powerful creatures. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. So I'm recording this in the morning. I'm actually going to take a sip of my tea and just kind of intake some of this good juiciness of a nice hot cup of tea. It's cold here in Montana where I live. It's gray sky, but like is often the case, what I've come to realize is, when I look up at the skies, I see these amazing cloud formations and these amazing skies that are, nothing like just a solid feel of gray. There's energy there. There's information there. And I've talked about the power of clouds and all of that. And I'm experiencing that for sure this morning. So just a little extra little message there on clouds and all of the things that ways that nature can help us, because I really do believe that when we go into nature, it does help us. It does help us. So let's dive into birds. I'm going to take a sip of my tea first, and then we'll get started. Okay, that was a lot of slurping, but I don't know. I needed to take more than one sip. Yeah. So, birds. In episode 12, I talked about, this bird in Italy. And I also, I think, talked about somewhere in one of my shows, I also talked about how I hadn't really thought that birds were that significant when I was younger, to me, but I realized they were, even like in I guess it was first grade through, I don't know what grade it was. We lived at a house, and of course we lived at a house, but we lived in a particular house before we moved to another house that I lived in my teen years, etc., through when I graduated high school and then left for college. But in that house, that first house, we had these cardinals and blue jays, and they would nest in this kind of almost like this little, I don't know, it was like this interesting thing on the side of our driveway. It was like this little felt like, to me as a kid, it kind of felt like this little magical spot. There were these branches from some kind of bush that kind of arched around, and it was right next to the neighbor's property. We had an older couple that lived next to us. I'm going to take another sip of my tea. We had an older couple that lived next to us. They were very sweet. They had this very manicured yard. This garden that they took care of. And it's like this brush that was next to our driveway. It was like you'd look out the kitchen window and there would be the driveway where our cars were. It wasn't a very long driveway. And then there was this little kind of incline and this kind of stand of bushes that almost felt a little bit like a little enclosure, almost like a little, I keep thinking the word cave, but it didn't feel like a cave. It felt more like, I remember going up in there when I was a kid, and it kind of felt like one of those magical spots. Have you ever had that as a kid? Was there anything that ever just kind of felt like a magical spot, felt like a place where, I don't know, possibilities could happen or things could happen, or it felt kind of safe and cool, and there was something about the way that it was kind of enclosed, but it was also kind of open, and it just kind of felt like this little space where you'd kind of want to stay. And are you hearing my art cat scratching behind me, if you heard that? But it's a kind of place where you kind of would just want to go because it felt safe. It felt like it had possibilities. I'm putting to words feelings that I had as a kid about this place that I haven't thought about in oh my gosh, a long time, many, many decades. But I realized that's the way I felt about this spot. It's like I didn't go there often. It never occurred to me that I could, or that I would, or that I should as a regular practice, which is funny because I'd be all over that now, because that's what I talk about a lot, is engaging in a regular practice of doing things that feel good and taking care of myself and listening to myself. But back then, as a kid, I didn't know about doing that. But the thing is, and I think this is why I'm feeling called to share this as the opening of this episode, is that my inner self did know that. And my inner self would call my attention to this spot under these branches that kind of felt kind of safe, kind of sheltered, kind of magical, like they were teeming with possibility. And I realize now I'm like actually putting words to what the feelings I had when I would go into that spot when I was a kid. And when I went into that spot, it was just me going in there. But the other thing about this spot is that is where the cardinals and the blue jays had their nest. And so I don't know what drew me first, whether I'm thinking it was the birds. We would look out. I remember my mom, we had like a sink in front of our kitchen window. And if you were doing dishes or you were standing looking outside the window, you would look directly across to this spot under these branches across our driveway. And it was not a wide driveway. It was very narrow, so it wasn't that big of a distance. And you would, see these, these bushes, and the birds had a nest right there, and their babies, and they would fly around. And I remember as a kid really, kind of being amazed at the vivid colors of the birds. The cardinals with their bright red that seemed so powerful, really. The bright red was so bright, with the red and then the black. It's such a powerful, it's like this little bird that gives off such powerful energy. And the bluebirds or blue jays, I forget what they're called in Pennsylvania, but they were not like big jays. I guess they were just bluebirds. I think they were bluebirds because when I lived in California, we actually had jays, and they were big. But these are like the little guys, they were like blue with black, a little bit of black and white, and some kind of stripiness pattern kind of a thing. But, their blue was really brilliant and bright, and their coloring was just so amazing. And they used to really catch my eye. And I remember with my mom, we would kind of look out the window and be like, oh my gosh, look, they have a nest. Oh, they have babies. And you could kind of see the little nest. And I don't remember if it was like one year there was a cardinal family and another year there was blue jays, or there were two nests on each, like in each area. I don't know. I don't remember, and I don't know enough about birds to know, like, could they nest next to each other like that? I mean, I don't know. They could probably have like 10 feet of distance between each nest if that was the case. And I don't know enough to know whether that was possible, but that's really not what matters. What matters is something called my attention to those birds. And it may have been my mom at first, like, oh, look at those birds, or maybe she just noticed it and then I looked at it. But I really remember this having a really big effect on me, these birds. It's like they were so light and so kind of free. And, the way they took care of their babies, their eggs and then the babies, was always really, really powerful for me, to see that. And, one of the things that I've really kind of come to understand is, many, many years later, is how our inner self can often communicate things to us that it's important for us to know, because there's some kind of like some misconception we're living under, or something. And I think there's a way in which, as a kid, I really needed to see that kind of nurturing and care from the birds. And it really spoke to me, it really spoke to me. And I didn't really know what it meant, but here it is, like many decades later, and it's almost like I can go right back to some unknown age, but I can kind of just feel myself watching. And this is the amazing thing about the power of nature, and how it can be an avenue through which our inner self communicates with us. Here were these birds, and it was like they set up their nest there, and they kind of drew their attention, my attention to them, and it benefited me. I know it did. I also know that there's a way in which, when I went into that little area, even when the birds weren't there, it felt safe. It felt very nurturing. It felt kind of magical, in a world that I think, as a child, felt kind of confusing. I think kids, when they find a little magical place that kind of feels like anything can happen, like good things, that it's a really good thing, and my inner self was calling me to those birds to teach myself about that, to experience that, and to feel it. And I didn't even remember it at all. I remembered that I liked, and I had blue birds and cardinals at our house as a kid, but I didn't really realize until more recently how that was actually my inner self communicating to me about some things that I think were really important for me to understand. In this case, it was almost like, how there could be like just nurturing and love and a safe place and safe feelings and magic and delight and all of that. I think my inner self was really trying to communicate that to me. And that's part of why I was drawn to those birds. Like I said, I didn't realize it at the time, but I think some part of me took it in, took in the feeling of the birds, not the understanding, kind of like the ability to be able to articulate its words the way I am now, but the feeling of it. And so that was a really big deal. There's nothing light about that. And I don't really remember having any awareness of birds, really at all. Really at all. No kind of relationship with birds at all. Really until I think it was probably after college, when I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I started to, oh my gosh, speaking about the power of birds, we just had an amazing formation of, what are those guys? birds just circle above my roof. Like literally just right now, there were like 10. I thought they were geese at first, but they weren't geese. They were flying to kind of not erratically, but to not in a structured way that geese fly. But it was in my 20s as a young adult that I started noticing birds in California. They just flew over me again. I started noticing birds, and I started noticing vultures flying because they would soar. I did have that experience in Rome, Italy with that little bird. That's what that earlier episode was all about, episode 12. Episode 12. So that obviously was huge. That little bird changed the trajectory of my life, literally. But the other thing is that birds over and over and over again have affected me. Like when we moved to Montana, and I was trying to figure out how to set up our property for horses, so that I could bring a horse is what I thought, because I didn't really think about the fact that I would need a second horse for the first horse, because I'd been boarding my horses and I hadn't really thought about the social aspects of my horse. I mean, I kind of knew it, but I kind of wasn't thinking about it. So we were trying to get our property set up, and I spent a lot of time out, and I would have these amazing experiences with geese where I would just be, doing things outside, setting up setting up a shelter, setting up a pen, or taking care of my horse once he arrived. And it was like almost all the time I would hear this honking, and it would be like a formation of geese would fly overhead. And it was so amazing. It was so amazing to kind of feel that. But I've had so many interactions with birds. Like one of the, like I was talking about when I was in my 20s, and I moved to San Francisco, California, I think I started to really notice vultures and hawks more. And then when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I think it was, around in the very early 2000s, like very early, it's like 2001, I studied shamanism, and in doing that, one of the things that is shamanism has a lot of animal connection and earth connection. And so one of the things when you study shamanism is, there's something called a power animal. And one of my first power animals, not the very first one, but one of them was a hawk. And that hawk, I did a lot of work with clients too, because I also did a lot of other kind of modalities of things related to learning about energy and working with people when they had kind of like energetic blocks and health blocks and emotional blocks and mental stuff and whatever. And the hawk, because I also kind of came from a shamanic foundation back then, was kind of like a symbol for, they call it a power animal, but what I really realized that it was really a part of myself that was trying to, a deeper part of me, my inner self, that really knew more of who I was and what I knew, and was guiding me in knowing that I wasn't kind of in a way aware of, and that that knowing, kind of like I allowed myself to access it through my connection with this hawk, which kind of was one of my guides, if you will, or power animals. I've come to understand a lot about, and I don't practice shamanism anymore, but I haven't for a very long time, but I was informed by that period of my life for sure. And the stuff that was relevant to me that really resonated with me long term, really is still part of the way I look at nature and my connection with nature and animals. I just don't practice the kind of the tenets of shamanism and dogma. There's other things that I've come to understand that are really kind of going on. But what I ended up doing was starting to really open myself up to understanding the power of animals. And I'd always had that. I mean, I grew up with horses and I grew up loving cats and dogs and all kinds of animals, really. But birds became really significant for me in that period. And I think they were significant for me with the Cardinals and the Blue Jays. Actually, I realized I used to also watch robins a lot when I was a kid. I used to watch robins a lot because we had a lot of robins in Pennsylvania. And I always loved, watching them, especially in the spring, they kind of came out. I think there's a lot that I learned about robins and that they taught me. But when I lived in California, when I was an adult, and then after, I studied shamanism, I started to really understand or start to understand how to look for birds, not like go out and seek them, but be open to them is what I mean. And then birds became almost kind of like a language. It was almost like me being willing to study like when you study a foreign language, you're like, yeah, I'm open to this language. I'm open to communicating in this way. And I believe that our inner self, is always asking us to communicate with our inner self and is looking for ways that we can start communicating with our inner self. We can start having a communication and is looking for ways in which we're open for that communication to happen. It's almost like kind of like our inner self is like, well, how do you want this communication to work? And for me, nature is something I've always loved, and nature is a way that, from the beginning, my inner self is communicated to me and with me. And I think it communicates with a lot of us because it is nature. It is natural. And I think that it connects with the nature and the natural that is in us. And so, my inner self being like, hey, what kind of, what's going to work for you? And it was kind of like, well, I kind of like birds. And I kind of realized like I liked birds as a form of communication. I wasn't aware that I was saying this to myself, but now I am. I was saying to myself, I like birds. Please communicate to me through birds. And so that is what happened. I started kind of like having experiences with birds, like noticing birds when I would go hiking, noticing for whatever reason, well, I know what the reason is now, but there were reasons why like raptors were really important to me. I think when I was little, birds like symbolized kind of fun and freedom, so that you could have fun and you could also be free. You could just kind of, like little birds, they kind of like, they often kind of fly around and I don't know, they just kind of seem kind of energized, they just kind of seem energized and they just kind of seem like they're having fun and freedom. And in episode 12, I talked about this bird in Rome, this little bird. It was almost like the freedom that bird was experiencing was giving me a message that I could have freedom. I could have freedom from the plans that I had had that I thought I was supposed to be continuing on, that I had all planned out about, like how to make my life a certain way. But my inner self kind of had another option in mind. And, this little bird kind of helped remind me of that. And I really felt like I was calling myself to realize I could live in a different way. And it changed the trajectory of my life. I'm very clear that if I did not make that choice that I did in Rome that day, my life trajectory would be different than what it's been. I know that. So these little birds have this energy. But then I started to really, resonate with raptors, like hawks and eagles. Not as much eagles in the beginning. I don't know. I didn't like eagles that much until I moved to Montana. Now I love eagles because we have them here and I see them. Although I did have an experience in Alaska with eagles that I think opened me up to eagles, actually. And there was a guy that did this stuff in videos in Alaska about eagles that really taught me about eagles. So let me change that. I did connect with eagles prior to moving to Montana, but I kind of wasn't aware of it. Now I love eagles because we have them here and they're so amazing. But raptors, mostly hawks, and owls, but also birds like vultures. We had a lot of vultures in California. Turkey buzzards is what they called them, and you didn't see them kind of up close. You'd see them from far away. And what was always so amazing to me was how beautiful they flew. The vultures that were there, what they would do is they would get, especially in the Bay Area because of the way the winds are and the Golden Gate, they would get this wind, I forget what they call it, this wind loft, almost like a pillow of air and a wind, and they would just soar around and around and around. And so often, wherever I was hiking, when I lived in Marin County, which is just north of San Francisco over the Golden Gate Bridge, or when I moved back to California, I lived in the East Bay, and all over the Bay Area, really, you could see vultures a lot of the time, and you just saw almost like this brown wingspan with a little bit of white underneath, but you could always tell they were a vulture by how they flew. They were so graceful. They were so they seemed to have a lot of fun and joy in how they were flying, and I would just watch them. And just feel the energy of them. And it's funny, even as I'm talking right now, I'm realizing that there's certain things that I was learning by watching them that I've not even been conscious of until now. Right now in this moment, I'm not going to talk about them right now because they're not relevant to this episode, but it's stuff that I was getting the feeling. I was resonating with the feeling of these vultures, the freedom, the feeling. This is the kind of stuff that I've learned how to embrace by listening to my inner self. It's something I've learned how to practice in how I engage with my horses, how I do my art, how I try to live. Really is kind of like listening to myself in a flow of energy and a freedom. And I think there's a way in which those vultures that I watched, just because it was hard not to see them, they were all around in the skies. You would just look up, and it was beautiful beautiful in the Bay Area, and you'd look up and you'd just see these vultures like flying. They weren't like circling like they were trying to feed on something. They were just flying around because they would catch this drift of air and they were delighting. It was like they were expressing delight in how they were flying. I know cartoons, they depict this whole thing like, oh, when vultures are circling, they're going to prey on something, whatever. That's not what was going on. What I'm talking about is these vultures were having fun. They were having fun and they were delighting. And I think there's a way in which when I moved back to California, it was after my mom had died, and there was a lot of stuff going on with me in which I was learning how to let myself, give myself permission to have fun, give myself permission to feel good, give myself permission to just delight no matter what anybody else thought. And in a way, that's kind of the message of a vulture. It's kind of like some people think of vultures as these like scary, ugly things. And I think they're beautiful because they showed me how to embrace my energy and just flow, how to work with the energy around me and just let myself be free and soar. And that's a really powerful thing. It's something that I have learned to do more and more in all of my work, like all steps of my career. It benefited me. Years ago when I worked as a writer, I learned to kind of get into a flow with writing. And then it benefited me when I worked in business development in the technology industry, in the software industry, in the interactive internet industry in San Francisco. It benefited me when I started my first startup company, which was a .com company. I was the CEO and founder because I learned to let my own energy and creativity flow to come up with an idea that was really innovative and really innovative at the time. I started a consulting business in which I helped other people grow their businesses and start their businesses. And that freedom and that flow is what I learned to, I'm going to take a sip of my tea. I learned to kind of allow myself to tune into that. And that helped me with my clients. It helped me create brands for my clients. And it helped me then when I went on to become an interior designer. Because in interior design, I learned how to flow my own energy. This stuff is all connected. It's like those vultures taught me things about my own energy by displaying it with their energy. And it helped me. I wasn't always conscious of it, and I often wasn't conscious of it in a way. Like if someone asked me in some year, what do vultures mean to me, I would not be able to articulate it in the way that I would now. But some part of me felt that and took it in. There's some part of me that stopped and looked at a vulture and just watched. And that benefited me. It benefited me because some part of me was calling myself to understand how I could feel more free and flowing in myself. And that's what the vulture was doing, regardless of what anybody thought. And that was another thing I had to kind of learn how to do, was to disregard how it looked on the outside, disregard what anybody else thought, and learn to care about how it felt to me. That's a big thing of what I talked about in my very first podcast. I wasn't able to articulate it in the way that I do now, but I was giving myself permission to feel good in my very first podcast, Creating from the Inside Out, because I hadn't known that I could do that. Now I know I can do it, and I know I can practice it, but it's still an ongoing thing. But the vultures taught me that. The vultures helped me understand that. And there's so many times where things in nature can do that for us. And so many times for me, in which birds have become kind of like a communication channel for how my inner self is trying to communicate things to me that I am calling myself to know and feel. And, for me, I felt it when I moved to Montana and I looked up and I saw the geese. I felt this amazing feeling seeing the geese. I felt it since I've been in Montana, and I started to see eagles. We don't have vultures here. I don't know if they exist at all, but I never see any. It's certainly not like California, but we have eagles, and the eagles, when I see them, are amazing. I've had connections with ravens and crows that have been profound, a lot. And with owls, oh my gosh, owls. When I lived in California, I had a major connection with owls in our neighborhood. I had connection with hummingbirds. I've had connections with little chickadees. I've had connections with little, I don't know what they're called. I'd have to look up the kind of bird. My husband and I called them these little racer birds that we had on our property in California, in the East Bay before we moved to Montana. I've had connections with all kinds of birds. And the thing, I'm sure that I could have another episode on birds, and maybe I will. But the thing that I think is relevant to share, if you're listening to this, and why I felt called to share about this today, is that if you have some kind of resonance with birds, what I have found is that there's a reason for it. There is a reason for it. There's something about the essence or energy of that particular bird or the birds that you feel a resonance with that is speaking to you. It's communicating to you, for you, because of something that you want to experience or know, or something you want to do more of, or you want to enjoy, or you want to give yourself permission to do. And I find that this is such a big way in which nature can communicate with us. And nature has communicated, with me through all kinds of aspects of nature: trees, the wind, weather, plants, birds, horses, animals, all kinds of animals, wildlife, domestic animals. Oh my gosh, the list goes on and on, on and on and on, which is what I'm talking about in this show. But if you feel drawn to birds, what I have come to understand is, like anything that anything that I feel like I resonate with, that gives me some kind of feeling that feels right, what I have found is that it benefits me to be open to more of that. It's almost like kind of being like, I like that. It's almost like going through on a questionnaire and being like, it's like our inner self is looking for ways in which we want to be communicated to, when how, what method. And it's almost like we're being given a checkbox, do you want trees? Do you want art? Do you want birds? And if you resonate with birds, it's like, put that check next to birds, because what can happen, this is what I experienced, is that when we do that, that our inner self can start to use that as a way for us to communicate with us. And I can't tell you over and over and over and over again how actively, since I started kind of being like, I really love birds and I really want to engage with birds. So it's been, actively, consciously me over 30 years, 20 some years, I would say, 20 some to 30 years, depending upon when I consciously started thinking about birds, that I've been like wanting a communication that way. And my inner self has been delivering. I've had birds show up in my life, and I've had birds that when I am feeling in the deepest, darkest places in my life, a bird has helped me. I've had moments when I have been really lost and a bird has appeared and helped me. Not help me like, hey, like talking to me and being like, hey, can I give you a hand? Can I give you $20? More like there's something about their energy. And when I tune into how I feel when I'm looking at them or when I'm watching them or when I just become aware of them and I let myself listen to myself, that it's giving me something that I was calling myself to know. Calling myself to know that actually I am better for it. I've benefited from it. And if you resonate with birds and this speaks to you at all, and if it doesn't, go find something that does, But if this speaks to you, which I'm guessing if you're listening to a podcast on the power of nature and how nature can communicate with you, I'm suspecting that there's some way in which you've been feeling that nature has communicated with you or could communicate with you or you'd like it to. Check that box. Check that box if birds resonate with you. And the way we do this is we just acknowledge. We acknowledge our feelings and we acknowledge we feel something. And we kind of almost like say to ourselves, and it doesn't have to be out loud. It can just be in our minds, or we could write it down, or we could say it out loud. It doesn't matter. But we kind of say to ourselves, I feel something. And I'm going to be open to feeling more. And that's all it takes. That's really all it takes to start the pathway for how I find that the power of nature can be utilized as a way for us to start communicating or, communicating with nature, which really is our deeper inner selves, is aligning with the beautiful, beautiful elements of nature. And we can receive the exact messages and information and guidance and knowing that we are calling ourselves to know. And it can be awareness, it can be thoughts, it can be feelings, it can be physical benefits like health benefits, and more. So that's what I wanted to talk about in today's episode, and I'm going to leave it at that until the next time. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of the Power of Nature podcast. To learn more about me and my other offerings, you can visit my website at michellewaldo.com. That's MICHELLEWALDO.com.